Before we get into today's stories, never miss an update by signing up for the Dread Weekly newsletter on dreadsarmy.com. The link is in the description too. Get the latest encounters, trail camera footage, and news in your inbox once a week. Now, let's get to the story. I am a local farmer from West Virginia and have made this place my home for over 30 years. I was under the impression that I had experienced all this life had to offer until last Tuesday, when an incident occurred that I simply cannot ignore. Late in the evening, I found myself out in the fields mending a broken fence. My cows had exhibited strange behavior lately, and I considered the possibility that they were being spooked by something. The atmosphere was dense, and there permeated a smell somewhat akin to sulfur that I couldn't quite place. I initially attributed it to the fertilizer, but the scent was markedly stronger than usual. Reflecting on it, I remember that the sulfuric scent had been present for a few days leading up to the peculiar incident. My neighbor, Mrs. Higgins, noted that her dog had been unusually restless at night, and she was convinced that the smell was the cause. I dismissed it at the time, but given the subsequent events, I can't help but wonder if there was a link. Additionally, I recall finding a few dead birds near the barn, an abnormal sight. They appeared as if they had been frightened to death. The atmosphere was electric, akin to the charged environment before a thunderstorm, despite the clear sky. It was as though the entire farm was in a state of nervous anticipation, awaiting some impending event. While I was busy with the fence, I noticed the cows clustering in a corner of the field, their agitation evident. I thought I heard a rustle from the neighboring trees, but I didn't give it much thought. Shortly after, the lights on my tractor flickered and went dark. I reasoned that it was merely a power surge, but the incident struck me as peculiar. Upon finally fixing the fence and preparing to return home, I spotted it. On the other side of the fence stood a creature, approximately 6 feet tall, possessing bent legs and a skeletal exterior that seemed covered in scales. What truly startled me was its face, bearing a resemblance to a demonic horse, complete with glowing red eyes and an elongated tongue. As I stood immobilized, I took in further details of the creature. Its skin was a blend of brown and black and appeared coarse, somewhat like the bark of a gnarled tree. Its wings, which I initially compared to those of a bat, seemed more dragon-like upon closer observation. The creature's head was the most terrifying aspect. While bearing some resemblance to a goat, it possessed a sinister twist, boasting bizarre, almost goblin-like features. I could swear I noticed what seemed to be horns jutting from its head. As the creature's long tongue darted in and out, its eyes transitioned from a fiery red to a glowing yellow. It felt as if it was assessing me, contemplating its next move. The already thick air seemed to further densify, and the sulfuric smell grew almost unbearable. I stood petrified for a moment, unable to believe the sight before me. My heart hammered in my chest, and I could feel sweat accumulating on my brow. The creature emitted a noise, a strange blend of a growl and a hiss, and then spread its wings. They were reminiscent of a bat's wings, but were of a significantly larger scale. It stared at me for what felt like an eternity before ascending into the night. I made a dash for my house, moving as quickly as my legs could carry me. Upon reaching home, I secured all the doors and windows and spent the remainder of the night attempting to process the spectacle I had just witnessed. Come morning, when I ventured out to inspect the fence, I found unusual marks on the ground, similar to scrapes from something. However, upon closer inspection, these strange marks on the ground appeared to form a pattern, akin to a symbol of some sort. It was etched deeply into the earth, as though created by an incredibly strong force. I snapped a few pictures with my phone, hoping someone might be able to make sense of it. I also noted that the sulfuric smell had dissipated, replaced by an eerie silence. The cows maintained their huddled position, and even the birds seemed to be avoiding that part of the field. After a conversation with Mrs. Higgins, she mentioned her dog had regained its calm for the first time in days. It felt as though whatever was disturbing the farm animals had departed, or was simply lying in wait. Sleep has been elusive since that night. Every time I close my eyes, I find myself confronted by that creature's face. I can't identify it, but it was unlike anything I have ever seen before. In the days following that night, I have been conducting research and engaging in discussions with some of the older local folk. There are old legends of a creature known as the Night Terror that supposedly frequented these parts in times past. This creature is believed to be a guardian of the forest, an entity not of this world. The descriptions provided in these legends align eerily with the creature I saw. Some locals even suggest that it serves as a harbinger, a creature that appears when something adverse is on the horizon. While I'm unsure if I subscribe to these beliefs, it is hard to disregard the parallels. Moreover, I have been plagued by dreams wherein I find myself back in that field with the creature. However, it does not appear threatening in these dreams. Rather, it seems as though it is attempting to communicate with me. Each time I wake up before deciphering the message. The dreams are so realistic that it is difficult to shake them even after gaining consciousness. I am at a loss about how to proceed, Donovan. I don't want to be dismissed as the delusional farmer who claims to have sighted a monster, but I'm also unable to explain the happenings of that night. I thought perhaps you or someone from your show might have some insights. Before I get into the meat of this story, I feel it is necessary to provide some context. I need to bring you into the orbit of the world I used to live in. The year was 2015. A time when life for me was just about solitude and the tranquility of the wilderness. I was a man living on the fringe. I was a bit reclusive, you might say. I was choosing the company of nature over the hustle and bustle of human existence. But on one fateful night in late September, the tranquility of my world was shattered, and it hasn't been the same since. The place I called home was not your typical suburban house or modern city apartment. No. My home was a rustic cabin that lay deep within the heart of the Florida Everglades. I was far removed from the noise and distractions of civilization. The cabin itself was nothing grand, but to me it was a fortress of solitude, a retreat where I could get lost listening to the wind and the sounds of nature. The Everglades is a unique region of wilderness. It is a sprawling landscape in southern Florida filled with lush greenery, murky waters, and rich biodiversity. This marshy wonderland stretches as far as the eye can see, with towering cypress trees standing as ancient guardians over the swamp. The swamp was an integral part of my life. It was my backyard, my fishing pond, my slice of wild heaven. Nearby, the meandering waterways teemed with an array of wildlife. Alligators basked in the sun, herons hunted in the shallows, and the occasional deer would stop by for a drink. As an individual who appreciated the wonders of Mother Nature, this vibrant ecosystem was my source of constant fascination and tranquility. Yet this seemingly idyllic paradise turned into a hunting ground on that bone-chilling night in September. Just as midnight was closing in, the cacophony of the swamp fell eerily silent. The crickets stopped chirping and the frogs ceased their croaking. At the time, I was sitting out on my porch enjoying the night when I noticed a peculiar movement in the water. It was an odd disturbance that was out of sync with the usual rhythm of the swamp. I pushed myself up from the worn-out wooden rocking chair on my porch and squinted into the moonlit marsh. All the while, my heart was pounding with a rhythm of unease. A peculiar disturbance caught my attention. Something was disrupting the water's natural flow and creating ripples that seemed alien to the rhythm of the swamp. I knew something wasn't right, and that was more chilling to me than the night air. Emerging from the murky depths, I watched as a figure began to take shape, solidifying my fears into a tangible reality. It was a hulking figure. The silhouette was monstrous and towering in the moonlight. It had to be at least 8 feet tall, the height itself invoking fear. This was not a creature that belonged in the Florida Everglades. It didn't belong anywhere on Earth for that matter. Its eyes were what caught my attention next. They were an ugly yellow, the color of decay and disease. They pierced the gloom like a pair of glowing embers. They radiated an intense evil light. The glare was hypnotic and captivating, yet filled with an intensity that made my blood run cold. As my gaze descended from its eyes, I took in its entire face. A face that could have been ripped straight from a horror film. It was reptilian, bearing an uncanny resemblance to an alligator or a crocodile. But what was most disturbing was not the inhumanity of it, but the fact that this monster, this grotesque mimicry of nature's design, stood upright, balancing itself on two legs. The creature moved awkwardly, yet it moved with a purpose. It was heading towards me, and its heavy footfalls were squelching in the swampy mud, sending shivers down my spine. I could hardly breathe as I stood there. My body was frozen in a mix of fear and disbelief. Here, on my humble porch in the heart of the Everglades, I was face to face with a monster, a nightmare brought to life. It was a terrifying moment where my sanctuary turned into a scene from a horror movie. The sight was absolutely horrifying. Luckily, my feet worked and I jumped inside my cabin, securing every window and door from the inside. I even pushed every piece of furniture I had against the doors with the hopes of keeping the thing out. I spent the night huddled in a corner, listening to the creature scratch against the wood, its guttural growls resonating through the rooms. As dawn broke, the chilling sounds receded and I was left in the silence of my home. I couldn't help but feel that my sanctuary had been violated. The days following the encounter were a blur. I left my beloved home and returned to civilization in a way that I never thought I would. I moved in with my sister for a while and spent many months there before being able to return. Needless to say, life has never been the same since that encounter. The wilderness that once brought me peace has become a source of unending terror, for I know what lurks within the depths of the Everglades. It's an abomination of nature, a creature of nightmares, and it's forever etched into my memory. There's a ritual in the national park where I work. Until recently, I didn't quite understand it. It felt like some sort of hazing, like a prank reserved for the newest ranger. Our park is vast. It's the kind you have to dedicate a whole weekend to if you really want a taste of what the woods have to offer. There's more beauty out here than you could possibly see in a single day. I guess there's ugly out here too. When I first started, I was put on the night shift. The other guys seemed to be eager to leave that post behind. I figured it was because of the weird hours. That wasn't exactly the case. I'd start my nights by punching in and setting up shop in a small security office. My job, for the most part, was watching cameras, cleaning up after the day's visitors, and evaluating any projects that might need to take place the following day. Plus, of course, the ritual. When they told me about the chicken, I thought it was a joke. Then I showed up for my first shift, and sure enough, there was a whole skinned chicken waiting on my desk. Wrapped in plastic, dropped off by a member of the day crew. They told me I'd need to walk it into the woods, following a specific trail before unwrapping it and slapping the meat down on an old tree stump. Then I'd go back to work as usual. The first night, I laughed and did as I was told. I wasn't going to let their little hazing practice get under my skin. I played along, hardly concerned with my duties or my surroundings. Then the chicken was there on the second night. But the joke was over, I thought. Just seeing another whole chicken on my desk made me groan. I was agitated. How long were they going to keep at it? I took it out the second night too. This time I was too frustrated to shrug off the world around me. Following the marked trail, I realized something. The woods were different at night. I'd conducted all of my interviews and undergone my training during daylight hours. Out there, when the sun was down, the forest was strangely quiet. When the wind blew and the leaves rattled, it sounded more like a rumbling stomach than a whistling brush. The sound made my skin crawl. So I dropped the chicken on the stump, and that night I ran back. Night 3 was when I made my mistake. I didn't want to go out in those woods again, not with enough raw meat in my hands to make me feel like bait. I tossed the offering in the dumpster instead. The rest of the crew wouldn't know one way or another, would they? Not until I was long gone for the day. They could chew me out for skipping their little ritual all they wanted. But it wasn't the park rangers who came looking for me. It was something else. I saw it on the cameras first. It looked like a dog ran past the parking lot feed. I stared at the camera a while after the blurry shape disappeared, but the dog didn't come back. I heard a scurrying outside the security booth and locked the door to the outside. It was a raccoon or an opossum. I was sure, but a chill was creeping up my neck anyways. I focused on the cameras. Then the dog returned. It was at the dumpster sniffing around the edge. It must have come looking for its offering. Only no normal dog could have understood that concept, right? A normal dog would have stuck around the tree stump, waiting for its master to add food to its bowl. It wouldn't have come looking not like this. Then again, it wasn't a normal dog on the cameras. It was a huge one. It was twice the size of any mastiff I'd ever seen. If it hadn't been walking on all fours, pointing with its muzzle to sniff out its meal, I would have thought I was looking at something else entirely. I would have called it a bear or a lion of some kind. But its head was strictly canine. And even if its patchy physique reminded me of a man's in some locations, I couldn't imagine it was anything but a hound. A massive, disfigured hound of some kind. Its gnarled back and man-like shoulders had to be a defect, right? In those ways, it was enough unlike a dog to make me doubt. It was enough to push that chill further throughout my body. When the beast turned from the dumpster, I felt an icy grip on my heart. It felt like I was watching a monster crawl out from beneath the bed. It was stalking its way toward the security booth, apparently dissatisfied with the thought of huffing the scent of chicken all night. It wanted something more. I knew it. It wanted to find a bigger meal since the easy one was no longer on the table. I waited and braced myself for the creature to come knocking, slamming, or scratching against the door. When it never did, I sighed. I sat wrapped in my dread until the sun came up, and the next park ranger arrived to relieve me of my duty. When he saw my face, he only shook his head. He already knew, I suppose, that I'd failed to place the chicken where it belonged. He patted my shoulder and said to take the next night off, that the former night ranger would be resuming his duties. I did as I was told. After a cautious phone call, I was moved to work the daylight hours. I never did go back after dark, but the ritual still asks for my help at times. Once or twice a month at the end of my shift, it's me. I'm now sometimes dropping a chicken off at the night ranger's desk. Edward Grimes' experience in the Pennsylvania National Forest is a chilling one. He believes he was stalked by an entity that was not a bear, something far more intelligent, larger, and potentially harmful. Edward's story is truly intriguing. He had an encounter he wished to share with me in central Pennsylvania, around the Susquehannock National Forest. This was back in 2018 when he went on a hiking trip with a close friend with whom he has been buddies for a long time. A little bit about Edward's background. He claims to be a very enthusiastic outdoorsman and a seasoned veteran hiker. He's traveled all around the country and has a personal goal of hiking at least 100 miles a year. He's also certified in first aid. Their hike started around 10 a.m. It was a beautiful day and the weather was fantastic. They were walking through dense forest with occasional clearings, interspersed between thickets of trees and bushes. The area, as they describe it, is very remote with no houses or roads for miles around them. Edward confides that he felt something strange from the beginning, but didn't want to alarm his friend, so he kept quiet. After about an hour of hiking, they stumbled upon a small clearing where they could see far into the distance due to their elevated position on the hillside terrain. As they stood there in this open space, admiring the scenery, Edward noticed a large shape moving behind some brush about 50 yards away to the northeast. Initially, they thought it was a dog, but the size was much larger than they had first estimated, which left them bewildered. They started observing more closely, but the dense brush made it difficult to see the creature clearly. From what they could make out, It was very large, and they both suspected they were looking at a massive black bear. Suddenly, the creature seemed to stand on its hind legs. The undergrowth still obstructed their full view, only allowing glimpses of the animal. They watched for several moments as it moved effortlessly in the dense undergrowth. Edward and his friends soon noticed something even more ominous. They felt as though they were being watched. Within moments, the horrifying realization dawned on them. They were being stalked. Edward describes the hair on his neck and arms standing on end as they felt several pairs of eyes on them, despite not seeing any. Knowing they were in danger, Edward and his friend knew they had to leave, but fear paralyzed them. They were afraid something might attack them if they moved. Mustering enough courage, they began to retreat from the clearing. As they did, their suspicions were confirmed. They heard heavy movements from the deep woods on both sides. Edward recalls hearing a deep, raspy breathing that reminded him of his late grandmother, who was a longtime smoker and died of emphysema. This sound, along with the breaking tree limbs, suggested that whatever was following them was enormous. The fear escalated because they realized that if this was a black bear, its behavior was uncharacteristic, as bears don't hunt in packs. Also, the raspy breathing hinted at a large animal. Their pace quickened as the unknown entities started following them. They felt the woods around them go silent, a sign of a large predator's presence. The entire journey back, they felt as if whatever it was, possibly a bear, wanted them out of its territory. After the encounter, Edward ensured his friend was all right. He confided that he was hesitant to share the full experience publicly, fearing ridicule. However, he believes they encountered Bigfoot, despite how unlikely that might seem. This area has a history of peculiar occurrences, from UFOs, strange lights in the forest, to sightings of strange creatures. Edward admits that if it was really a black bear that they saw that day, the behaviors of the entities in the woods didn't make any sense. He argues that animals either make their presence known when humans are nearby, or they disappear, leaving only sounds of movement and breath. People have claimed to see a very tall, upright, and carnivorous creature near the same forest in Pennsylvania. Could this be what they encountered that day? Could a case like this be considered an encounter? I don't know. Black bears often become the go-to explanation for many Bigfoot sightings. If this was a case of misidentification, how do we explain them being stalked in the woods by other equally large animals? Is it possible that Edward and his friend saw a massive black bear from a distance, which they misidentified as a canine, and the stalking by other animals was just a coincidence? When I brought this up to Edward, he admitted that while he initially doubted it was Bigfoot, several things led him to believe that it wasn't a black bear. The silence in the woods, the feeling of being driven out of a territory, seemed far too aggressive for a group of black bears. But truth is often stranger than fiction. What do you guys think of this story? Not a lot of people from outside of Montana know about the beauty of Flathead Lake. Unless you're really invested in the world of fishing, there isn't much reason to learn about our little body of water. I shouldn't say little, I guess. Flathead Lake is massive. Almost 200 square miles, if I remember right. You can check out that stat. I know I'm not too far off. You can check any part of this story, actually. I'd love to be proven wrong. I'd love to know what happened on the surface of Flathead Lake. I'd settle for anything other than what I believe right now. I was out kayaking and planning to go from one side to the other. And that's not something I recommend doing alone if it's your first time. As for me, I'd been kayaking plenty of times, but I'd never challenged myself with something as great as the 25-mile length of Flathead. I'd been to the lake plenty of times too, hiking the perimeter, fishing from the bank, and skimming the surface in a kayak or canoe. It was a favorite date spot of mine, actually. Everyone loves a little time on the water, especially at sunset. I don't think I'll be taking anyone back to Flathead anytime soon, though. That sunset view is important. I forgot about that. I timed my day so that the last stretch of my journey would happen right at dusk. I wanted to relax at the finish line and watch the sky change colors. Then I'd pack up and head home. A friend of mine would be waiting with a trailer to tow my kayak. I didn't make it there on time. As the day started to wind down, the surface of the lake got more and more empty. Tourists were going home. Fishermen were going to grab a bite to eat before returning to catch what they could under the cover of darkness. That was maybe the first time I was actually alone on Flathead. It's at least the first time I remember. Maybe that's because of what happened next. I was maybe 3/4 through my route when I saw something sticking out of the water. It looked like tree branches, long and wiry, rising out of the surface. Now, plant life can come loose in the lake at any time. Trees can fall and be washed into the water, only to turn up later, more buoyant and rotten. Something about this was different, though. The way the branches broke the surface and split into multiple limbs. It reminded me of an elk's antlers. My dad used to keep a set hanging above the fireplace. That itch of nostalgia convinced me to go investigate. I knew the horns or branches or whatever they weren't naturally occurring in that spot. I expected to run into a log, push it aside, and return to my night on Flathead. The branches didn't budge, not at first. They certainly were buoyant or floating, and they definitely didn't show any signs of being strips of rotted wood. They were covered in something smooth and damp. It reminded me of a fish's skin. Small scales so tightly grouped that they feel like one smooth surface. It was all wrong, all of it. That sense of touch had me so confused that I convinced myself that this mystery was mine to solve. I grabbed the branches with both hands and tried to shake them. Then something moved under the water. There was a ripple on the surface that rocked my kayak. The branches turned as if there were eyes attached to each stalk that wanted to look my way. They rose a bit, maybe 3 inches out of the water. Maybe I had knocked it loose, I thought. So I leaned over the edge to get a better look. The shape under the surface wasn't a tree. It was a fish, I think. It looked like one. I had cast my line enough times to identify the things that lived in Flathead. This one looked like sturgeon. A massive, frightening sturgeon. 20 feet long, I mean. Long enough to shake any man. I could see its head. I could see the massive antlers running all the way back to its skull. If I could have jumped from my kayak to the shore, I'm sure I would have. I yelled. I flailed. I almost capsized, I think. The fish jerked away from my kayak and darted back down. The antlers disappeared from above the surface, knocking against the edge of my boat as they disappeared. I got out of there as quickly as I could. I told my friend, who insisted we call the Office of Fish, Wildlife, and Parks. They dismissed me immediately. I tried to go federal. The National Park Service came to speak to me, but spent the entire conversation asking if I had been drinking on the boat that day. I showed them the scratches on my kayak from where the antlers scuffed the edge. They told me not to call again. They said if I did, that I'd be arrested. Do they have the authority to do that? What crime would I be guilty of exactly? It didn't make sense to me then, and it doesn't now, but what am I supposed to do? I asked around after that. I talked to some locals. I'm not the only one who's seen something on that lake. Apparently, weird sightings go back for hundreds of years. Could the fish I saw have been that old? I didn't think something like that was possible, but I felt it in my own hands. I touched it, you know? I can't pretend that didn't happen. It's all I talk about now. My friends, even the one who was there that day, have started to look at me with fatigue and concern. I'm that guy. I'm the guy at the bar telling a story that you don't believe. After all, you don't believe me now, do you?